I got fired for helping a homeless veteran. What happened next will shock you. You know how they say life can change in a heartbeat? Well, mine changed in exactly 47 seconds. I know, because I counted every tick of that lobby clock while I watched my 15-year career circle the drain like yesterday's coffee. But let me back up a bit. My kingdom was a lobby of Randall Industries, this glass fortress right in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. For 15 years, I knew every crack in that marble floor, every dust particle dancing in the morning sunlight streaming through those floor-to-ceiling windows. The job was about as exciting as watching paint dry in slow motion, but I took it seriously, real seriously. See, I'm a National Guard vet. Did my time, came home, and found myself playing hall monitor for corporate America. But here's the thing, I didn't see it as just punching a clock. This was my post, my watch. These people walking through those revolving doors every morning, they were under my protection, whether they knew it or not. My wife, Sarah, used to joke that I was married to that job more than I was to her. She'd roll her eyes and say I'd probably start sleeping with my security badge around my neck. But there was love in her voice when she said it, you know? That gentle ribbing you get from someone who's been putting up with your quirks for years. Sarah was the kind of woman who could make a Tuesday feel like Christmas morning. Blonde hair always pulled back in this messy bun that somehow looked perfect. Laugh lines around her eyes from 15 years of putting up with my dad jokes. She worked part-time at the local library, which was perfect because someone had to be home when our son Kevin got back from school. Kevin was 16 then, all knees and elbows and attitude. You know how teenagers are. Half the time he acted like I was the most embarrassing thing since cargo shorts with sandals. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me like I hung the moon. Those moments made everything worth it. Then there was my brother Lucas, 2 years younger than me, but somehow managed to act like he was still in high school. Lucas was what you might call between opportunities, which is a fancy way of saying he hadn't held a steady job since the last time the Cubs won the World Series. Before 2016, I mean. He had this talent for making you feel guilty about having your life together. Every family dinner turned into a production where I was the villain for working steady, while he was still finding himself at 36. Mom and Dad never said much, but I could see it in their eyes. They were tired. Tired of making excuses, tired of covering his rent, tired of pretending everything was fine. My parents lived out in Mechanicsville. In this little ranch house they'd been paying off since I was in diapers. Dad worked maintenance at the paper mill until his back gave out, and Mom cleaned houses until arthritis made it too painful. They were good people who played by the rules their whole lives and still couldn't quite make ends meet. That's America for you sometimes. I'd slip them a few hundred whenever I could, pretending it was for Kevin's birthday or some made-up reason. Pride's a funny thing. It'll let you starve before it lets you ask for help. But here's where my story gets interesting. See, I had this habit that probably sounds crazy to most folks. Every shift, I'd pack an extra sandwich, sometimes two, and I always kept a spare blanket in my trunk. Richmond's had a share of homeless folks, especially downtown. Most people walk right past them like they're part of the scenery. But when you've worn the uniform, when you've seen good people fall through the cracks, you start to notice things. You start to see the stories behind those weathered faces. I'd see this one guy, Charlie, every morning on my walk from the parking garage. Probably in his 50s, gray beard, always polite. Found out he was a Desert Storm vet who lost everything when his wife got sick. No family, no safety net, just the street, and whatever kindness strangers might throw his way. Then there was Maria, this older lady who'd set up near the bus stop. Used to be a teacher before budget cuts and a series of bad breaks. Left her with nowhere to go. She'd sit there reading these beat-up paperback novels, trying to maintain some dignity in an undignified situation. These weren't just homeless people to me. They were neighbors who'd hit rough patches. They were reminders that any of us could be 3 paychecks away from sleeping under a bridge. So yeah, I'd share my lunch. Sue me, my little rebellion against the world's indifference. I called it. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would get me nominated for sainthood. Just basic human decency wrapped in wax paper. Now, Randall Industries had policies about this kind of thing. Strict policies. No unauthorized personnel in the building. No exceptions. No excuses. They made that crystal clear during orientation, and they reminded us every quarter during those mind-numbing security briefings. But sometimes policies and conscience don't line up real neat and tidy. It was a Tuesday night in February when everything went sideways. The kind of night that makes you question why humans ever decided to live anywhere north of Florida. Wind was howling like it had a personal vendetta against anything warm, and the temperature had dropped into the teens. I was doing my final rounds, checking locks and making sure all the office drones had remembered to turn off their computers. The lobby was empty except for the night cleaning crew, and even they were wrapping up early because of the weather. That's when I saw him. This guy was huddled against the outside of the main entrance, wrapped in what looked like an old army tarp. But it wasn't just any guy. Even through the glass, even in the dim lighting from the street lamps, I could see something familiar in the way he carried himself. The way he sat wasn't random. It was tactical. Back to the wall, eyes scanning, ready to move. This was somebody who'd been trained to think about exits and sight lines. I walked to the door and got a better look. He was maybe early 40s, Latino, with that particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping rough. But his eyes, man, his eyes told a story. They were hollow but alert, defeated but dignified. Those were soldiers' eyes. Here's the thing about being a veteran. You recognize your own. It's like a frequency only we can hear. This guy had served, probably seen things that would give civilians nightmares. And now he was freezing his butt off outside of corporate headquarters while executives in heated offices counted their money. The temperature was dropping by the minute. I could see his breath coming out in these short, sharp puffs. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. So I had a choice to make. Follow the rules and let a fellow veteran potentially freeze to death, or do what my conscience was screaming at me to do. Really wasn't much of a choice at all. I opened that door and looked him straight in the eye. His name was Jake, I found out later. Jake Rodriguez, Navy veteran who'd done 2 tours in the Middle East before coming home to find out that thank you for your service doesn't pay rent or buy groceries. I didn't ask questions, didn't need his life story, just stepped aside and let him in, told him he could warm up in the lobby for a while, maybe grab some coffee from the machine. Jake didn't say much at first, just nodded and found a spot on one of those uncomfortable leather couches. They'd probably paid more for than I made in 3 months. But I could see the relief in his shoulders as the heat started working its way back into his bones. We sat there for maybe 20 minutes, not talking much. Sometimes that's what people need, just to be treated like human beings instead of problems to be solved or ignored. Jake had this way of carrying himself that reminded me of guys I'd served with. Proud but beaten down. Strong but struggling. Eventually he started talking. Told me about his service. About coming home and finding out that his wife had cleaned out their bank account and disappeared. About job applications that went nowhere and a system that seemed designed to chew up veterans and spit them out. When he finished his coffee and stood to leave, Jake looked me right in the eye and said something I'll never forget. "You're the first person in months who looked at me like I was still human." That hit me harder than any thank you ever could, because that's all any of us really want, isn't it? To be seen, to matter, to be recognized as something more than a problem or statistic. But here's what I didn't know while we were having this moment of basic human decency. Every second of it was being recorded in high-definition digital video. Randall Industries had cameras everywhere. I mean everywhere. The kind of surveillance setup that would make Big Brother jealous. Motion sensors, facial recognition, the works. And me letting Jake in had triggered all of it. The next morning started normal enough. I showed up at 7, badge ready, coffee in hand. But instead of my usual routine, I got called upstairs to the executive floor. That's never good news for security guards. The meeting was in this conference room that probably cost more than my annual salary to furnish. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble table that could double as a landing strip, chairs that probably had more technology than my car. Sitting across from me was HR Director Margaret Walsh, a woman who could freeze hell with her stare, and Security Chief Robert Thornton, my immediate supervisor. They had a laptop open between them, and I had a sinking feeling I knew what was on the screen. Thornton didn't waste time with pleasantries. Pulled up the security footage, and there it was, me opening the door, Jake walking in, the whole thing played out in crystal clear detail. They called it a gross violation of security protocols. Said I'd put the entire building at risk. Talked about liability and insurance and corporate policy, like they were reading from a holy book. I tried to explain. Told them Jake was a veteran, that it was freezing outside, that basic human decency should count for something. But you know what? They didn't want to hear it. To them, I'd broken a rule. End of story. 3 days later, I was cleaning out my locker and turning in my badge. 15 years of perfect attendance, 0 incidents, commendations from management. None of it mattered. I'd shown compassion to a fellow human being, and that was unforgivable. The termination letter was full of corporate speak about failure to maintain security standards and violation of established protocols. But what it really said was that caring about people was a firing offense. Driving home that day felt like the longest trip of my life. How do you tell your family that you just flushed 15 years of steady employment down the drain? How do you explain that you've lost your health insurance, your pension contributions, your entire livelihood because you couldn't let someone freeze? Sarah was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming while she prepped dinner. Kevin was at the table doing homework, probably complaining about algebra or whatever torture they were putting him through in sophomore year. The look on Sarah's face when I told her, man, that's something I'll never forget. It went from confusion to disbelief to this raw panic that made my chest tight. She didn't yell at first, just stood there holding a wooden spoon like it might somehow fix everything. Then the question started. How could I be so reckless? What were we going to do about the mortgage? What about Kevin's college fund? What about insurance? But here's the thing about Sarah. Even in the middle of her panic, she got it. Sort of. After the initial shock wore off, she looked at me with this mixture of love and exasperation and said, I get it, Mike. I really do. But what are we supposed to do now? Be good people and homeless? That question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, because she wasn't wrong. Principles don't pay mortgages. Compassion doesn't keep the lights on. Kevin looked up from his homework with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was seeing his dad for the first time and wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The hero worship in his eyes was replaced by something that looked dangerously close to disappointment. Later that night, I could hear him on the phone with his friends, explaining why his dad had lost his job. The shame in his voice cut deeper than any corporate termination letter ever could. The family dinner that Sunday was a special kind of torture. Mom had made her famous pot roast, the kind that usually brought everyone together. But the tension in that little dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lucas, of course, couldn't resist twisting the knife. Made some comment about how I'd managed to throw away everything our family had worked for because I had a bleeding heart. Said I'd put our entire family at risk for some stranger on the street. Dad just shook his head and said they'd always worried I was too soft for my own good. Mom tried to be supportive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. They were already struggling, and now they knew I couldn't help them anymore. Might even need their help, which was about as appealing as a root canal without anesthesia. That night, lying in bed next to Sarah, I could feel the weight of what I'd done settling on my chest like a boulder. She wasn't talking to me, just lying there staring at the ceiling. The silence was deafening. 3 weeks went by. 3 weeks of job applications and rejection letters. 3 weeks of watching our savings account shrink while the bills kept coming. 3 weeks of Sarah's increasingly worried glances and Kevin's growing resentment. Everyone kept asking the same question. Was it worth it? Did 20 minutes of warmth for a stranger justify destroying everything we'd built? But you know what? Even with everything falling apart around me, even with my family questioning my judgment and my bank account bleeding red, I knew one thing for certain. Decency doesn't come with a price tag. And if I had to choose between my job and my soul, well, I'd already made that choice. You ever notice how life has this sixth sense of humor? Just when you think you've hit rock bottom, Someone hands you a shovel and points to the basement. 3 weeks of unemployment applications. 3 weeks of rejection emails that all said the same thing in corporate speak. Thanks, but no thanks. It was like being blacklisted from a club I never wanted to join in the first place. The unemployment office was a special kind of purgatory. Fluorescent lights that made everyone look like they were dying, plastic chairs that squeaked every time you shifted, and that smell, desperation mixed with industrial disinfectant. I sat there for 4 hours just to be told that my termination for policy violation made me ineligible for benefits. The caseworker, a tired woman with dead eyes, looked at my file like I'd personally offended her grandmother. Apparently, getting fired for letting a homeless veteran warm up makes you a liability. Who knew? The job interviews were worse than the unemployment office. Word travels fast in Richmond's corporate circles, and somehow my story had gotten twisted in the telling. By the time it reached potential employers, I wasn't the guy who showed compassion. I was a security guard who couldn't follow simple rules. One hiring manager actually asked me if I had authority issues. Another wanted to know if I could be trusted to make rational decisions under pressure. Every question felt like a punch to the gut. I started avoiding mirrors. Couldn't stand seeing what I'd become. This hollow-eyed guy who jumped every time the phone rang, hoping it might be good news, but expecting another rejection. The world had decided I was damaged goods, and I was starting to believe in myself. Sarah tried to be supportive at first. She'd make my favorite coffee in the morning, pack me sandwiches for those soul-crushing interview marathons. But I could see the worry eating at her like acid, the way she'd check our bank balance when she thought I wasn't looking. The bills kept coming, of course. Bills don't care about your moral crisis or your employment status. The mortgage company sent their first friendly reminder after 30 days. Kevin needed new soccer cleats. The car started making that grinding noise that means expensive repairs are coming. Every night, Sarah and I would sit at the kitchen table with our laptops, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up right. 2 months of savings, maybe 3 if we cut everything to the bone. After that, well, we tried not to think about after that. Then came the morning that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making coffee. The cheap stuff now, not the good beans Sarah used to buy. When I heard voices through the thin wall that separated our house from our neighbor's backyard, Tom Bradley, the guy next door, regional manager at some tech company, always bragging about his quarterly bonuses. But it wasn't Tom's voice that stopped me cold. It was Sarah's laugh. That specific laugh she used to save just for me, the one that meant she was genuinely happy about something. I walked to the window, and there they were. Sarah and Tom, sitting on his deck, sharing coffee and what looked like an inside joke. Nothing obviously wrong about it, except for the way she was looking at him, the way she used to look at me. You know that feeling when your stomach drops into your shoes? When your brain tries to rationalize what you're seeing, while your gut screams that something's very, very wrong. That was me, standing in my own kitchen, watching my wife flirt with our neighbor like I didn't exist. I told myself I was being paranoid. Unemployment stress. Financial pressure. Making something out of nothing. But then I started noticing things. How she'd suddenly developed an interest in gardening, right along the fence line where Tom worked in his yard. How she'd volunteered to take out the trash, lingering by the curb when his car pulled in. How she'd gotten offensive when I mentioned seeing them together. The lies started small. A made-up book club meeting here. A fictional grocery store run there. But lies have this way of growing, like weeds in an abandoned lot. Soon she was creating elaborate stories about where she'd been and who she'd seen. I followed her one Tuesday afternoon. Felt like a complete creep doing it. But I had to know. She said she was going to her sister's place. But instead she drove straight to the Marriott downtown. Sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before Tom's silver BMW pulled up next to her. Watching them walk into that hotel together felt like dying in slow motion. Every step they took was another nail in the coffin of everything I thought I knew about my life. I didn't confront her that night, or the next night, or the night after that. Instead, I became this pathetic detective in my own home, looking for evidence of what I already knew. Text messages she thought she deleted. Credit card charges at restaurants I'd never been to. A new perfume that smelled nothing like the woman I'd married. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the pity, the way she'd look at me sometimes, like I was this broken thing she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. Like I was the family dog with cancer that everyone knew was suffering, but no one wanted to put down. When I finally found the courage to ask her about it, she didn't even try to deny it. Just sat there at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd planned our future, where we'd helped Kevin with homework, where we'd laughed over Sunday morning pancakes, and told me she was in love with someone else. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. Matter of fact, clinical. She was sorry, but she couldn't pretend anymore. Tom made her feel alive again, made her feel like she mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd lost my job for trying to make someone feel human, and my wife was leaving me because I'd stopped making her feel that way. 3 months later, the divorce papers arrived via certified mail. Sarah wanted the house, primary custody of Kevin, and half of everything else, which, given our current financial situation, wasn't exactly a king's ransom, but it was everything I had left. Kevin chose her side, of course. Can't blame the kid. She offered stability. I offered uncertainty. She had a plan. I had excuses. She had Tom with a steady income in his big house. I had unemployment benefits that I couldn't even collect. The day they moved out was the longest day of my life. Kevin wouldn't even look at me while he packed his stuff. Just threw his clothes and video games into boxes, like he was erasing our life together one item at a time. That's how I ended up at the Richmond Rescue Mission at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night, holding a plastic bag with everything I owned and wondering how 15 years of marriage and steady employment had led to this. The shelter was exactly what you'd expect. Industrial carpet that had seen better decades. The smell of disinfectant fighting a losing battle against despair, and that particular kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they're auditing for a zombie movie. I was sitting on a cot that had probably been donated sometime during the Reagan years, trying to figure out if this was actually my life or some extended nightmare, when I heard a familiar voice. Mike? Mike Thompson? I looked up and there was Jake Rodriguez, the guy who cost me everything, or saved me from everything, depending on how you looked at it. He looked better than he had that night in the lobby. Clean clothes, decent haircut, still thin, but not that scary kind of thin that comes from not eating. But those eyes, those were the same eyes. Still alert, still carrying weight. Jake, I managed. Fancy meeting you here. He laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Yeah, well, the accommodations aren't exactly 5-star, but it beats freezing on the street. We talked for hours that night. Jake told me his story, not the abbreviated version from that lobby, but the real one. 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home with PTSD, and a Purple Heart that didn't pay rent. His wife couldn't handle the nightmares and the mood swings, so she cleaned out their savings and disappeared. The VA promised help that never came. Job applications that went nowhere, because potential employers saw the gaps in his resume and made assumptions. Friends who stopped calling because his problems made them uncomfortable. But here's the thing about Jake. He wasn't bitter. Angry, sure. Frustrated, absolutely. But not bitter. He talked about his situation like it was a problem to be solved, not a life sentence to be endured. You know what the real tragedy is, Mike, he said, sketching absent patterns on the scratch table between us. There are millions of us out there. Veterans, working people who hit a rough patch, families who are one medical bill away from losing everything. And we're all fighting for scraps while empty buildings sit vacant and construction crews build luxury condos nobody can afford. That's where he pulled out this beat-up folder. Inside were architectural drawings, blueprint for something he called modular housing units. Simple, efficient, affordable. Designs that could be mass-produced and assembled quickly, giving people dignity instead of charity. I used to be an engineer, Jake explained, his finger tracing the clean lines of his sketches. Before the war, before everything went sideways. These aren't pipe dreams, Mike. These are real solutions. Looking at those drawings was like seeing sunlight after months of darkness. Not just because they were brilliant, though they were, but because they represented something I hadn't felt in forever. Hope. Here was a way to turn our shared catastrophe into something meaningful. A way to help people like us. People who've been written off by a system that valued profit over people. We could actually do this, I said, and for the first time in months, I meant something I was saying. We could build these. Help people. Jake smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been thinking about it since that night you let me into your lobby. You saw me as a person when everyone else saw a problem. That's exactly the kind of company I want to build. One day, I want those words etched in steel above our door. The idea was crazy, of course. Two guys with no money, no credit, and no connections trying to revolutionize affordable housing. It was the kind of plan that would get you laughed out of any sensible business meeting. But sensible business meetings had given us a world where veterans slept on the street while luxury condos sat empty. Maybe it was time for a little insanity. I spent the next week sketching out business plans on napkins and researching grants on the shelter's ancient computer. Jake refined his designs, calculating costs and materials with the precision of someone who'd built things in places where mistakes could get you killed. When I finally worked up the courage to call my parents, Mom answered on the second ring. I could hear the relief in her voice. They'd been worried sick since Sarah told them about the divorce. But when I started explaining my plan to start a construction company with a guy I'd met at a homeless shelter, that relief quickly turned concern. Mike, honey, Mom said in that voice she'd used when I was 7 and wanted to be an astronaut cowboy firefighter. Maybe you should focus on finding a regular job first. Something stable. Dad was even less encouraging. Reminded me that I'd already lost everything by being too trusting, too naive. Asked if I really wanted to risk what little I had left on another lost cause. When I mentioned needing startup capital, maybe a loan against their house or my old truck, the conversation got uncomfortable fast. They were already struggling, Dad reminded me. They couldn't afford to lose their home because I wanted to chase pipe dreams with a stranger. I hung up feeling more alone than ever. My family thought I was having some kind of breakdown. My ex-wife was building a new life with a man who could provide stability. My son was learning to call another man dad. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was just desperation masquerading as ambition. But that night, Jake came back to the shelter with news that changed everything. He'd been working the phones, calling every veterans organization in Virginia. Most had blown him off, but one, a small nonprofit called Heroes Haven, had a grant program for veteran-owned startups. It's not much, Jake said, waving a printed email like it was a winning lottery ticket. $5,000. But it's seed money. It's a start. $5,000 wasn't enough to build an empire. Hell, it wasn't enough to rent a decent apartment for 3 months. But it was enough to buy tools, enough to lease a small workspace, enough to build a prototype. Most importantly, it was someone believing in us when everyone else had written us off. Standing there in that homeless shelter, looking at Jake's architectural drawings and a grant approval letter, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night I'd opened the lobby door. Purpose. You know this is completely insane, right? I told Jake. The best ideas usually are, he replied. Besides, we're not trying to change the world overnight. We're just trying to build one warm roof at a time. And sometimes that's enough to start a revolution. Maybe $5,000 couldn't change everything, but it could change one person's life. And maybe that was enough for now. The sound of a circular saw cutting through 2x4s at 6 in the morning is either music to your ears or torture to your soul. For me, it was both. Jake and I had found this garage on the outskirts of Richmond, and I used the term garage loosely. It was more like a concrete box with delusions of grandeur. No heat, fluorescent lights that flickered like they were having seizures, casting long, eerie shadows, and a roof that leaked in 3 different places, leaving damp, dark patches on the concrete floor. The air always smelled faintly of old oil and damp concrete, but it was ours for $200 a month, and beggars can't be choosers. Our first day in that frozen concrete paradise, we laid out Jake's blueprints on a folding table that had seen better decades. The modular housing design looked simple enough on paper, prefabricated walls that could be assembled like giant Lego blocks, with basic electrical and plumbing systems built right in. How hard can it be? I asked, looking at the neat lines and precise measurements. Jake just laughed and handed me a hammer. Famous last words, my friend. He was right. Building something in your head and building it with your hands are two completely different animals. That first wall panel took us 3 days to complete, and it looked less like a precision engineer component and more like a collaboration between a toddler and a blindfolded beaver. The corners didn't line up, the electrical conduit was crooked, and somehow we'd managed to install the insulation upside down. But we kept at it, every morning at dawn, every evening, until our hands were too cold to hold the tools. Jake had this way of explaining engineering principles that made sense, comparing load-bearing beams to the human spine, talking about thermal efficiency like it was a living thing that needed to breathe. I learned more about construction in those first 2 weeks than I'd learned in 40 years of living. How to read a level, how to cut a straight line with a saw, how to swear creatively when you hit your thumb with a hammer for the 15th time. The best part wasn't the building, though. It was the talking. Jake and I would work side by side for hours, sharing stories about our service, our families, our dreams that had gotten derailed somewhere along the way. He told me about his daughter in California, who hadn't spoken to him since his divorce. I told him about Kevin, and how I felt like I was losing him one angry phone call at a time. Kids forgive easier than adults. Jake said one afternoon, while we were wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of drywall, they just need to see that you're not giving up. By the end of our 3rd week, we had a prototype. It wasn't pretty, looked like a shed that had been designed by committee and built by people with vision problems. But it was solid, weatherproof, and according to Jake's calculations, it could house a family of 4 for about 1/3 of what a traditional apartment would cost. We stood there looking at our creation, covered in sawdust and joint compound, feeling like we just climbed Mount Everest in flip-flops. That's when reality decided to crash the party. Turns out, you can't just build houses wherever you want, even if they're technically temporary structures. Who knew? The city of Richmond had very specific ideas about what constituted legal housing, and our modular units didn't check any of their boxes. We needed permits, inspections, approvals from the Planning Commission, the building department, and probably the ghost of George Washington himself. The first person we met at City Hall was a guy named Robert Thornton, and yeah, same last name as my old security chief at Randall Industries. Turns out they were cousins, and Robert had heard all about the troublemaker who'd violated company policy and gotten himself fired. He looked at our plans like they were written in crayon by kindergartners, asked questions designed to make us feel stupid, made comment about amateurs try and play in the big leagues. These structures don't meet minimum square footage requirements, he said, pointing to a regulation that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter years. And the electrical system isn't up to code. Jake tried to explain that we were building transitional housing for veterans, not luxury condos, that our electrical system was actually more efficient than what most apartments used, that square footage requirements were part of the problem we were trying to solve. Thornton wasn't interested in solutions. He was interested in following rules, and our little revolutionary housing project didn't fit his neat bureaucratic categories. He gave us a stack of forms longer than a CVS receipt and told us to come back when we had our paperwork in order. I wanted to argue, to point out that while we were drowning in red tape, veterans were sleeping in parking lots. But Jake grabbed my arm and steered me toward the door. "Pick your battles," he said once we were outside. "This is a war, not a skirmish." That night, I called Tommy Martinez, a guy I'd served with who now worked for the VA, explained our situation, asked if he knew anyone who might be willing to cut through some of the bureaucratic nonsense. Tommy laughed and reminded me of something our old sergeant used to say. "The world's a big place, Thompson. There's always someone out there who'll believe in your idea, if it's worth believing in." He was right. Within a week, we had meetings set up with 3 different veterans organizations, a congressional aide who specialized in housing issues, and a city councilwoman who'd been pushing for affordable housing initiatives for years. Progress. Slow, frustrating, bureaucratic progress, but progress nonetheless. That's when my brother Lucas decided to stick his nose where it didn't belong. I should have seen it coming. Lucas had always been jealous of anything good that happened to other people, especially me. When we were kids, he'd break my toys rather than play with his own. As adults, he'd found more sophisticated ways to sabotage success, often with a smile and a seemingly innocent question designed to plant seeds of doubt. The rumors started small, whispers in the veteran community that Jake and I were skimming money from our grant, that we were using charitable funds to line our own pockets, that the whole modular housing thing was just a scam to get rich off other people's misfortune. At first, I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Then Mom called and asked if it was true that I was stealing money from homeless veterans. She'd heard it from Lucas, who had heard it from people who knew people. The investigation hit us like a freight train carrying bureaucracy and powered by suspicion. Auditors from Heroes Haven showed up at our garage with clipboards and attitudes. They wanted receipts for every nail, explanations for every expenditure, documentation for every decision we'd made. Jake and I spent 3 days going through our books, explaining why we bought lunch from a hardware store deli, justifying the cost of coffee for our all-night building sessions. Everything we'd done was legal, ethical, and documented, but that didn't stop the investigation from feeling like a colonoscopy performed by accountants. During those 3 days, we couldn't work, couldn't buy materials, couldn't even touch our prototype without permission. I sat in that cold garage, staring at the wall panels we built with our own hands, feeling like I was back in that corporate conference room, getting fired all over again. The worst part was knowing it came from family. Blood turning against blood because success made some people uncomfortable. But here's the thing about accusations. They either stick or they don't. And ours didn't. The audit cleared us completely. Every penny accounted for, every expense justified. Heroes Haven not only reinstated our grant, but increased it, impressed by our documentation and progress. The rumors dried up like puddles in August sun. That's when we got our first real client. Veterans Housing Alliance of Central Virginia wanted to pilot our modular units at a transitional facility in Henrico County. 6 units to start, with the possibility of expanding if the project worked out. It wasn't a huge contract, but it was validation, proof that our crazy idea might actually help people. Jake and I worked like men possessed for the next month. 12-hour days, 7 days a week, building and refining and perfecting our design. We'd learn from our prototype mistakes, streamline the construction process, improve the insulation and electrical systems. The units were beautiful in their simplicity. Clean lines, efficient use of space, everything a person needed to rebuild their life with dignity intact. Then Hurricane Isabel decided to crash our party. The storm hit Richmond like an angry god with a grudge against roofing materials. 100-mile-per-hour winds, torrential rain, and enough falling trees to reforest Canada. When the weather finally cleared, we drove out to Henrico County to check on our units, hoping for the best but expecting the worst. 5 of the 6 units had weathered the storm perfectly. Dry inside, structurally sound, everything exactly as we left it. But unit number 3 looked like it had gone 10 rounds with a tornado and lost. The roof had partially collapsed, one wall was buckled, and there was enough water inside to start a small aquarium. Jake and I stood there in the mud, looking at our failure, feeling like we let down everyone who believed in us. This wasn't just a construction problem. It was a credibility problem. If our units couldn't handle a storm, how could we expect people to trust them with their lives? Well, Jake said after long silence, I guess we know where we need to improve the design. That's when I realized something important about my partner. He didn't see failure as an ending. He saw it as information. We spent the next 2 weeks tearing apart Unit 3, analyzing every beam, every joint, every connection point, found the weak spots in our design, figured out how to reinforce the structure without adding significant cost. It was like performing surgery on our own dreams. The rebuilt unit was stronger, better engineered, and more weather-resistant than anything we'd built before. When we were finished, Jake looked at it with satisfaction and said something I'll never forget. Now we're not just building houses, Mike. We're building fortresses. And they need to withstand everything life throws at them. The whole time we were dealing with bureaucrats and investigations and natural disasters, I was also trying to rebuild my relationship with Kevin. My son was 17 by then, old enough to drive himself to our awkward monthly dinners, old enough to make his own decisions about whether he wanted his dad in his life. Most of those dinners were exercises in polite small talk. Kevin would tell me about school, his girlfriend, his college plans. I'd tell him about the business, about Jake, about the units we were building. But there was this wall between us, built from disappointment and misunderstanding. One evening, after we'd exhausted our usual topics of conversation, Kevin looked across the table at me and said something that cut right through my chest. "Dad, you promised things would get better. You promised we'd still be a family." I didn't have a good answer for that. Couldn't explain that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you expect to pay. Couldn't make him understand that his old man was trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their comfortable life. But I could show him the units. So the next weekend, I picked him up and drove him out to Henrico County, where our 6 modular homes sat in a neat row like Hope Made Manifest. Kevin walked through each unit, running his hands along the walls, testing the compact kitchens and efficient bathrooms. He stood for a long time in the center of one, just looking up at the ceiling, processing what he was seeing. Finally, he turned to me, a small, genuine smile flickering on his face, and said, "These are actually pretty cool, Dad. You really built these." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition, a crack in that wall between us. And sometimes, that's where forgiveness starts. The official opening ceremony for the Veterans Housing Alliance pilot project was small but meaningful. A handful of local officials, some folks from the VA, and 6 veterans who were about to have keys to their own front doors for the first time in months or years. I watched Jake hand over those keys, saw the looks on those men's faces as they realized they had a place to call home again. One guy, a Marine named Davis, who'd been sleeping in his car for 8 months, just stood there crying in the doorway of his new unit. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about building houses or starting a business or proving we could overcome obstacles. This was about human dignity, about giving people who've been written off by society a chance to rebuild their lives with pride intact. Jake and I stood there watching those veterans explore their new homes, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since that night I'd opened the lobby door for a freezing stranger. Purpose. Real, meaningful purpose that went beyond paychecks or recognition or personal satisfaction. "You know what this means?" Jake asked, watching Davis arrange his few possessions in his new kitchen. "What's that?" "We're not just putting roofs over heads, Mike. We're laying the groundwork for a whole new beginning. And that's a pretty good day's work." Looking back on those first few months of Hero Homes, because that's what we decided to call our little company, I realized they taught me something important about success. It's not measured in profit margins or growth charts or media coverage. It's measured in the distance between where someone starts and where they end up. And sometimes that distance is just a space between sleeping in a car and having your own key to your own front door. But for the person making that journey, it might as well be the distance to the moon. Success has this funny way of changing how people see you. One day you're the guy who got fired for showing compassion. The next you're the visionary entrepreneur everyone wants to meet. The Richmond Times-Dispatch ran a front-page story about Hero Homes 3 months after our pilot project opened. From security guard to social entrepreneur, how one man's firing led to a housing revolution. The reporter made us sound like we'd cured cancer and solved world hunger with nothing but determination and lumber. That article changed everything. Within a week, my phone was ringing off the hook. Veterans organizations from across Virginia wanted to discuss contracts. City planners from Norfolk and Virginia Beach were asking about our modular designs. A congressional aide called to discuss federal housing initiatives. But the call that really caught my attention came from a guy named William Harrison, a lawyer from D.C. who specialized in veteran affairs. Harrison drove down to Richmond the following Tuesday, pulling up to our little garage in a BMW that probably cost more than Jake and I had made in the past year combined. He was exactly what you'd expect from a D.C. attorney. Expensive suit, perfectly styled gray hair, handshake that could crack walnuts. But when he started talking about his work representing veterans pro bono, something in his voice changed. This wasn't just business for him. It was personal. "Gentlemen," he said, looking around our makeshift workshop with genuine interest, "I don't see builders here. I see architects of the future. I've reviewed your pilot project, studied your cost projections, and talked to the veterans living in your units. This isn't just innovative. It's revolutionary. Jake and I exchanged glances. Revolutionary was a big word coming from a guy who probably charged $500 an hour. Harrison explained that he'd been looking for investment opportunities that aligned with his values. He'd made his fortune defending corporate clients, but now he wanted to use that money to actually help people. Hero Homes, he said, represented everything he believed in: practical solutions, sustainable business models, and genuine social impact. I'm prepared to invest $200,000, he said, pulling out a folder thick with legal documents. But I want to be clear, this isn't charity. I expect returns. I just happen to believe that doing good and doing well aren't mutually exclusive. $200,000. Jake and I had been scraping by on grants and good intentions, and suddenly we were looking at serious capital. The kind of money that could transform Hero Homes from a noble experiment into a real business. But success, I was about to learn, comes with its own set of problems. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected source: my own family. Lucas had been suspiciously quiet since our audit cleared us of any wrongdoing. I should have known he was planning something. My brother had never been able to handle other people's success, especially mine. He showed up at the garage one morning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a proposal that sounded almost reasonable. "Mike," he said, "I've been thinking about what you said before, about families sticking together, about second chances. I know I screwed up with those rumors, but I want to make it right. What if I came to work for you? I could handle logistics, supply chain management, that kind of thing." Part of me wanted to laugh. Lucas hadn't held a steady job in years, and now he wanted to manage our supply chain. But another part of me, the part that still remembered building tree forts together as kids, wanted to believe he'd changed. Against Jake's better judgment, I gave him a chance. Put him in charge of inventory and materials purchasing. Lucas seemed genuinely committed at first, showing up on time, staying late, even making useful suggestions about supplier relationships. For about 6 weeks, I thought maybe I'd been wrong about my brother. Maybe success really could change people. Then our accountant called with some questions about our materials costs. Expenses that didn't match up with our inventory. Invoices for supplies we'd never received. Purchase orders that had been altered after the fact. The investigation took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of going through every receipt, every delivery order, every piece of paperwork Lucas had touched. What we found made my stomach turn. He'd been skimming materials and selling them to other contractors, falsifying invoices to cover the theft, using our vendor relationships to set up side deals that benefited him personally. It wasn't just stealing. It was systematic fraud that could have destroyed everything we built. Confronting Lucas was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. This wasn't just about money or business. It was about family, about trust, about the fundamental belief that blood means something. When I showed him the evidence, he didn't even try to deny it. Just sat there with that same smirk he'd worn as a kid when he got caught breaking something, and blamed it on me. "You always thought you were better than me," he said. Mr. Perfect with his steady job and his happy family. Well, look how that worked out for you. The words hit like physical blows, not because they were true, but because they came from someone who was supposed to love me regardless of my flaws or mistakes. I fired him on the spot. More than that, I called the police. Watching my own brother get arrested was like watching a part of my childhood die, but I couldn't let personal feelings override business responsibility. The family fallout was brutal. Mom cried for 3 days straight. Dad accused me of being vindictive, of letting success go to my head. Even after I showed them the evidence, even after Lucas eventually pled guilty, they blamed me for not handling it within the family. Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you want to pay. But the alternative, letting family loyalty enable destructive behavior, costs even more in the long run. If I thought Lucas was the only ghost from my past who'd come calling, I was wrong. Sarah showed up at the Hero Homes office on a Thursday afternoon, dressed in what I recognized as her serious business outfit, the navy blue suit she'd worn to parent-teacher conferences and mortgage meetings. She looked exactly like someone who'd come to collect what she thought she was owed. "Mike," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk like she belonged there, "we need to talk about my stake in this company." I almost laughed. "Almost? Your stake? The initial idea for Hero Homes came to you while we were still married," she explained, pulling out what looked like a prepared legal argument. "That makes it marital property. I'm entitled to compensation." It was like watching someone rewrite history in real time. The woman who'd left me when things got tough was now claiming credit for the success that came after she was gone. The audacity was so profound, it almost made me admire her chutzpah, if not her ethics. But Sarah had underestimated one important factor. Jake's sister Amanda was a lawyer, a very good lawyer who specialized in business litigation and had a particular talent for destroying weak legal arguments. The court case lasted exactly 4 hours. Amanda methodically demolished every aspect of Sarah's claim, demonstrating that Hero Homes was conceived, funded, and launched entirely after our divorce was final. The judge didn't even need to deliberate. He dismissed the case immediately and ordered Sarah to pay our legal fees. Walking out of that courthouse felt like closing a book I'd been trying to finish for years. Sarah was finally completely, permanently out of my life. With Harrison's investment and our legal troubles behind us, Hero Homes began to grow in ways I'd never imagined. We opened a proper manufacturing facility, a converted warehouse in South Richmond, where we could build modular units on an assembly line. Our first employees were exactly who you'd expect, veterans and former homeless individuals who understood our mission on a personal level. People who knew what it meant to need a second chance, who approached their work with the dedication of soldiers on a critical mission. Within a year, we were shipping modular housing units across the Mid-Atlantic. Emergency housing for disaster relief, transitional housing for veterans, affordable starter homes for young families. Each unit carried that same philosophy Jake and I had hammered out in that freezing garage: dignity through shelter, hope through home ownership. I started getting invited to speak at conferences, appear on local TV shows, participate in panel discussions about innovative housing solutions. It was surreal. The guy who'd been fired for showing compassion was now being celebrated for building a business around that same compassion. But the moment that really drove home how far we'd come happened on a random Tuesday morning when I got a call from a commercial real estate agent. Randall Industries, my former employer, had gone bankrupt. They were liquidating their assets, including the glass tower I'd once called home. The asking price is $2.8 million. The agent explained. It's a good building, prime location. Just needs some updating. I should have said no immediately. We didn't need a downtown office building. Our warehouse operation was working fine, but something about the symbolism was too powerful to ignore. 3 weeks later, Jake and I stood in the lobby where I'd once worked security, now holding the deed to the entire building. We bought Randall Industries for less than they'd probably spent on executive bonuses in a single year. The renovation took 6 months. We converted the upper floors into apartments for transitional housing, luxury accommodations for veterans getting back on their feet. The middle floors became offices for veterans organizations and social service agencies. The ground floor housed Hero Homes headquarters, complete with a showroom displaying our latest modular designs. But the real statement was what we carved into the marble wall behind the reception desk. You saw me as a person when everyone else saw a problem. Jake's words from that night in the homeless shelter, now etched in stone for everyone to see. The grand opening was a celebration I'll never forget. Local officials, business leaders, veterans, advocates, and most importantly, the people whose lives had been changed by what we'd built. Davis, the Marine who cried in the doorway of his first modular home, now worked as our quality control supervisor. But the person I was most happy to see was Kevin. My son, now 21 and finishing college, had driven down from Virginia Tech to be there. He walked through the building with obvious pride, introducing himself to people as Mike Thompson's son. During my speech that evening, I looked out a crowd and saw faces that represented every chapter of my journey. Former Randall Industries, employees who treated me with respect, veterans who'd found homes through our programs, city officials who'd initially resisted our plans but now called us partners. And in the front row, wearing a suit that probably came from Goodwill, but pressed with military precision, sat an elderly veteran I recognized from our very first housing project. When our eyes met, he gave me a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement that made the whole crazy journey worthwhile. Not just gratitude, but restored dignity shining in his eyes. "I'm not a hero," I told the crowd that night. "I'm just a guy who once made a decision to treat another human being with basic decency." Everything else grew from that single moment of choice. The applause was nice, but what mattered more was the conversation afterward. Veterans sharing stories about how stable housing had helped them rebuild relationships with their families. Young entrepreneurs asking for advice about starting mission-driven businesses. Politicians discussing policy changes that could scale our impact. As the evening wound down and the last guest filtered out, I found myself alone on the roof of what had once been Randall Industries. The Richmond skyline spread out below me, lights twinkling like scattered stars. The air smelled like rain and possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Kevin. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Always have been, even when I didn't know how to say it." Standing there in the darkness, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, getting fired for showing compassion, losing everything I thought mattered, finding partnership with a homeless veteran who turned out to be a brilliant engineer, building a business that proved you could do well by doing good. Every setback had been a setup for something better. Every loss had cleared space for something more meaningful. Every person who'd written me off had been replaced by someone who believed in the mission. But the real measure of success wasn't the building I now owned, or the business I'd built, or the recognition I'd received. It was simpler than that. It was knowing that hundreds of veterans now had keys to their own front doors because one freezing night, I'd chosen humanity over policy. Hero Homes had grown beyond anything Jake, and I had imagined in that cold garage. We now had facilities in 4 states, partnerships with dozens of organizations, and a waiting list of communities that wanted to implement our programs. Yet, as I stood there looking out over the city, I realized our story was just beginning. Every light in every window represented someone who deserved a chance at dignity, at hope, at home. And as long as there were people who needed shelter and communities willing to provide it, Hero Homes would be there to build bridges between the two. The security guard who'd been fired for caring too much had become an entrepreneur who'd built a company around caring enough. And if that wasn't the American dream in action, I don't know what is. I pulled out my phone and called Jake, who was probably at home reading architectural journals and dreaming up new innovations. "You know what we should do next?" I asked when he answered. "What's that, partner?" "Build more than houses. Build a movement." Because at the end of the day, that's what America is all about, taking your worst moments and turning them into someone else's best opportunities. Taking your lowest point and using it as a foundation for something that lifts others up. And sometimes, if you're truly blessed, you find a partner like Jake, who not only believes in your impossible dreams, but helps you build them, piece by piece, into a better world for everyone.